If I add more purple, does it make it more gay? How queer are you? Is your favourite colour the queerest colour? Purple! Did you know the Lavender Rhinoceros took part in Boston's Pride March in 1974? Well, a papier-mâché lavender rhino to be clear. No animals were harmed during the making of Pride, or the making of this video. Hello lovely people, I'm Jessica, my pronouns are she, her, and welcome back to my channel where I make videos about queer history, disability, and parenting as a chronically ill lesbian. I love discussing LGBTQ+ culture and analysing fashion through an intersectional lens. If that sounds like your kind of thing, you should hit the subscribe button below, comment, and like the video to train your YouTube algorithm. Today we're going to be talking about the very queer history of the colour purple, by which I mean purple the colour rather than The Colour Purple, the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel by Alice Walker, or The Colour Purple, the 1985 film directed by Steven Spielberg, or The Colour Purple, the 2023 musical film, although the gay runs through. Purple is a regal colour. Throughout most of history, it's been reserved for the most wealthy people in society. It's associated with royalty, with power, with pride, and dignity, and creativity, and mystery. And while most people would think of the rainbow if asked which colour reminds them the most of queerness, though I'm aware rainbows have multiple colours, not just one. Even before Gilbert Baker's rainbow flag was introduced in 1978 as a symbol of LGBTQ+ pride, purple has been associated with queerness. You might know that the original pride flag design had 8 stripes, each with their own meaning. In this original design, the indigo stripe stood for harmony, and the violet stripe stood for spirit. Purple suggests a blurring of gender in a way that's really very queer. So we're going to explore the history of the colour and how it became analogous with the oh my god, why can't I say that word? How it got stuck to the LGBTQ+ community. Purple, the gays. Especially lavender and violet. It's why so many people were speculating about Taylor Swift's sexuality after she released Lavender Haze, especially as trans model Leif Ashley stars as her lover in the song's music video. Despite Lavender Haze absolutely not being the most gay song on that album. Before we dive in, I just want to give you a quick content warning that I am going to be discussing language used as pejoratives against the LGBTQ+ people throughout this video, as well as having more specific content notes for some sections of this video as we go through. As always, please take care of yourselves. I have a queer history channel, so some of the stuff is sticky. We can handle it. It's okay. The channel itself, still a safe space. Hercules' dog discovers purple dye. Purple is a rare colour in the natural world, which led to its status as a sacred colour reserved for use by kings, emperors, priests and magistrates. For thousands of years until the mid-1800s, purple dye could only be made from the mucus of sea snails, specifically the spiny Bolinus bundaris, also known as the purple dye murex. The purple yielded from the murex is known as Tyrian purple, named after the Phoenician city Tyre, on the coastline of the Mediterranean Sea, where the sea snails were found and still live. In an article for The Guardian, Annalisa Barbary writes that, amazingly, given how many were needed to sate the appetite of emperors and kings, they didn't actually become extinct. Tyre, in what is now Lebanon, is thought to be where the process of extracting the much-desired dye from the glands of sea snails was first developed and perfected, a process that dates back to at least 16th century BCE, though the process to make the dye was a lot less dignified than the colour itself. Barbary explains that the vats used to make purple sat right on the edge of the town because the process was a stinky one. The Roman author Pliny the Elder, not easily swayed by the fashion for purple, wondered what all the fuss was about, declaring it a dye with an offensive smell. Yes, it's the mucus of snails, but it's easy to see why purple was so alluring to everyone, apart from Pliny. Unlike other dyes which tended to fade quickly, Tyrian purple only intensified with wear. It's not surprising that at times the purple dye was worth more than its own weight in silver or gold. In an article for the BBC, Kelly Grover explains that purple was so revered that elaborate origin myths emerged to explain the dye's predestined discovery. They write that according to the 2nd century Greek grammarian Julius Pollux, purple was serendipitously stumbled across by the beachcombing dog of the demigod Hercules, the Roman god, who was on his way to canoodle with a nymph when his 4-legged friend just paused to gnaw on a sea snail on the seashore. When the nymph saw the purple-stained muzzles, Hercules' companion, she requested a garment of the same rich complexion. "Dead sea snail, get me one of those." Hercules' dog discovers purple dye by 17th century Flemish artist Peter Paul Rubens depicts this scene. But, as Grovia points out, the oil painting erroneously depicts a spiral nautilus shell rather than a prickly murex one. Get your snails right! It would take tens of thousands of sea snails to produce enough purple to dye even a small swatch of fabric. And Grovia claimed that its fibres retained the stench of the snail's desiccated mucus glands. So, vegans, purple? Not for you. Perhaps in part due to how exclusive the dye was, there were strict laws around who was allowed to wear Tyrian purple. Grovia explained that in ancient Greece, the higher your social and political rank, the more purple you could wear. Grovia writes that according to the Roman historian Suetonius, King Ptolemy of Mauritania's sartorial decision to cloak himself in purple one day on a visit to Emperor Caligula lost Ptolemy his life. Caligula interpreted the fashion statement as an act of imperial aggression and had his guest killed. Oh, fashion has always been political. The ancient Romans adopted purple as a symbol of imperial authority and status. The togas of the senators were trimmed in purple, and fully purple togas were usually reserved for emperors or generals during a triumph, a parade honouring a major military victory, for instance. And although, at this point in history, purple was seen as a symbol of power and often masculinity, because of, say it with me, the patriarchy. Purple's first connection with queerness also comes from the ancient world, specifically the poetry of Sappho. Speaking of ancient discoveries, have you ever wished you could step back in time to solve a thrilling mystery yourself? Well, let me introduce you to June's Journey, a captivating hidden object game set in the glamorous 1920s. Just like in the stories we'll be exploring today, June's Journey is all about uncovering secrets, solving puzzles, and immersing yourself in an intriguing narrative full of twists and turns. In the game, you follow June Parker, a clever and determined woman who embarks on a quest to solve her sister's murder. Each scene is beautifully illustrated, with detailed settings that draw you deeper into the mystery. You're obviously a history fan, so I think you'll really enjoy the stunning visual design of the game. From lavish mansions to bustling cities, it reminded me of the detailed worlds we're discussing in this video. And honestly, for someone like me who loves a good puzzle and a beautifully crafted story, it's the perfect escape when I'm trying to relax before going to sleep. Plus, you can even build and customize your very own estate, an added bonus for any vintage design lovers out there. So, if you are someone who loves history, mystery, and a little bit of adventure, I highly recommend giving June's Journey a try. It's free to download and it's available on Android, iOS, and even on desktop. Download June's Journey for free now using the link in the description and start your adventure today. And who knows, maybe you'll find some hidden objects faster than I do. Thank you so much to everybody who clicks onto the link and to June's Journey for coming back as a returning sponsor. We love our repeat sponsors around here and we show them lots of support because they keep the channel running. Now, back to another clever and determined woman. Sappho's Violets. I know, I've talked about Sappho before. Don't worry, you can go and watch that whole video for a whole rundown. But in brief, Sappho was a Greek poet who lived on the island of Lesbos in the 16th century BCE. She is renowned for describing her romantic and erotic poetry about women. She is literally where we get not only the word lesbian, but also sapphic, a very inclusive umbrella term describing attraction or relationships between queer women. In a post for Kew Botanic Gardens, Eddie Johnson writes that while very little of her poetry has survived in the modern day, the fragments that remain have had an unquestionable impact on the lesbian community. Yes, I speak for all of us when I say yes. Although Sappho wrote more than 10,000 lines of poetry, most of her work has been lost because the men burnt it. And we only have around 650 lines of her work today. Writing about queer botany, the University of Washington Botanic Gardens explains that it is believed that preservers actively neglected and destroyed her work. In 1711, a translator censored Sappho's poem, Ode to Aphrodite, by changing the subject of her desire to a man. During the Middle Ages, Christian figures condemned Sappho and ordered her remaining poetry to be burnt due to misogynistic and homophobic views of her work. I love this world. Banning or burning books to stop people learning about LGBTQ+ people has been happening for centuries. Yeah. I wonder when people understand that this doesn't actually stop queer people from existing. Sappho's poetry is full of botanical references, especially to violets, crocuses, and hyacinth. Many crowns of violets, roses, and crocuses. Together you set before more and many scented wreaths made from blossoms around your soft throat. With pure, sweet oil you anointed me, and on your soft, gentle bed you quenched your desire. No holy site we left uncovered, no grove. Oh, be still, my lesbian heart! Sappho's work often describes violets being worn, though different translations of her work give slightly different images. In an article for Dressing Dykes, Eleanor Medhurst, who is the author of Unsuitable, A History of Lesbian Fashion, which is a book that I really think you should go and buy, it's great, or rent from a local library, compares two translations of the same fragment of poetry by Aaron Puttigan and Josephine Palmer. In Puttigan's translation, Sappho watches the woman taking violets and roses and weaving a bouquet into a diadem. In Palmer's translations, wreaths of violets and twisted garlands were placed around the girl's slender neck. Medhurst explains that we can imagine the violets worn by a possible lover of Sappho twisted in her hair or thrown around her collar as the necklace. Either way, the girl is adorned, and Sappho preserves the image for eternity. It's all very, very gay. I love it. Medhurst continues that it's fitting that Sappho wrote of violets, hyacinths, and crocuses. Beauty, in this case in the form of the colour purple, was found, claimed, and celebrated even when not typically available. To me, this is a metaphor for lesbian love through history, found and cherished despite the odds. Even if we look at times when purple has been the opposite of desirable, the colour still reflects us. But before we get into how Sappho's poetry and violets inspired future generations of queer women, first we need to discuss the discovery that made purple much more accessible in people's wardrobes. Perkin discovers synthetic purple dyes. It wasn't until 1856 that we got a purple dye that wasn't made from seashells. I'm afraid there's no myth involving demigods about the discovery of this first synthetic purple dye, but there is a degree of serendipity involved, so... William Henry Perkin was working for Professor August Wilhelm von Hofmann at the Royal College in Chemistry in 1856, and he had been given the task to synthesize quinine from coal tar. Quinine was used to treat malaria, but it was expensive as it could only be sourced from the bark of the zinzona tree in South America. Perkin wasn't successful in synthesizing quinine, but he did discover someone else, entirely by accident. Something. He discovered something. In The Invention of the Colour Purple, Barbary says that Perkin had been adding hydrogen and oxygen to coal tar, and as you do, yes, and this heady concoction left a black residue in his glass jars. The black residue contained a violet substance that could rival Tyrian purple. According to Professor Andrea Stella in an episode of the Infinite Monkey Cage podcast, Hoffman looked at the substance Perkin had found and said that it wasn't quinine, but Perkin responded that it was beautiful. Hoffman told Perkin to get back to work, and Perkin told him that he quit. Perkin named the colour he'd created mauve, cleverly giving an air of French fashion and sophistication to his discovery. He set up his own business, manufacturing the first commercialised synthetic dye. Yeah, he made a lot of money, and also kick-started the pharmaceutical industry. In a CNN article about how lavender became a symbol of the LGBTQ+ resistance, Christabel Hastings quotes cultural historian and author of The Secret Lives of Colour, Cassia St. Clair, who said synthetic dyes allowed ordinary people to wear this special colour. In the mid-19th century, it was a fashionable colour, and men would pair lavender moleskin with doeskin trousers with blue waistcoats or claret-coloured coats without anyone batting an eye. Hastings goes on to explain that while initially purple was seen as a colour that was totally acceptable, even normal for people of all genders to wear, this changed towards the end of the 1800s. The public began linking purple, and specifically lavender, with homosexuality. What? Me? Gay? I can't believe you would suggest such a thing. A streak of lavender. Although there's no single event we can pinpoint in how lavender became associated with queerness, we can point to aestheticism, a European arts movement that eschewed Victorian wholesomeness and the perceived ugliness of the industrial age in favour of beauty, passion, and art for art's sake. Hastings notes that newspapers denounced aesthetics as effeminate, especially as a prominent figurehead of the movement was Oscar Wilde, who was not so secretly gay and tried and went to prison for gross indecency, which was the legislation that made homosexuality a crime. Purple is actually a motif of some of Wilde's work. He wrote, "And yet, what purple hours one can snatch from that grey, slow-moving thing we call time. My mouth is twisted with kissing, and I feed on fevers." Though it's worth saying that lavender isn't the symbol of queerness that Wilde is most well known for. He asked actors and some of his admirers to wear green carnations for the opening night of his play, Lady Windermere's Fan, in 1892. It's possible he borrowed this from the gay scene of Paris, but some scholars believe he thought of it himself. In a Tumblr post for The Advocate magazine, yes, my research for this video took me to some unusual sources. Scott McPherson also mentions artist Aubrey Beardsley played a role in this connection between lavender and queerness, writing that Beardsley's sexually explicit Art Nouveau depicted people of the same gender and, while quite controversial, led to conversations about homosexuality. Carl Sandburg's biography of Abraham Lincoln, published in 1926, further solidified this connection. Sandburg wrote of the former US president that a streak of lavender ran through him. He had spots soft as May violets. Hastings notes that this led to gay men in the US being taunted for possessing a dash or streak of lavender. I feel a streak of lavender could be totally the name of a gay haircut with lavender highlights that you might ask for at a queer barbershop. In 4 Flowering Plants That Have Been Decidedly Queered, Prager explains that many people have interpreted this description to mean that Lincoln has a queer side. He certainly had an intimate relationship with Joshua Fry Speed. She writes that historians disagree, but it's reasonable to interpret that lavender as meaning male-male love here, since there are other examples from the 1920s of lavender as a slang term to mean that. The true debate lies in how wide this streak was. Not convinced? Well, in From Lavender to Violet, the lesbian obsession with purple, Medhurst points out that while some argue that the lavender streak was in reference to effeminacy or vulnerability, it remains that these are traits associated with implied queerness in men. The obscenity of violets. As promised, we're back to Sappho, whose violets very much inspired queer imaginations. As Kiva Macmillan writes in the V&A Dundee, in the 19th century, poets conjured the world they glimpsed in the remaining scraps of Sappho's work. In From Lavender to Violet, the lesbian obsession with purple, Medhurst explains how violets became a purposeful lesbian adornment in early 20th century Paris. This group, who studied, referenced, and recreated Sappho's poetry and lifestyle, were called Paris Lesbos. Medhurst writes, amongst these women was Renée Vivian, a poet from Britain who created a new life for herself in France. Her appreciation for violets came in part from Sappho, but was strengthened by their association with her first love, a woman named Violet Chilito. They were a motif in her poetry, but also in her wardrobe. Medhurst explains that Vivian is said to have worn violets pinned to her chest during her saddest moments, but adds that they were not confined to her sorrow. Her friend, the author Colette, described violets as part of an intellectual exchange between the two, writing that whenever she gave me any of her books, she always hid them under a bouquet of violets or a basket of fruit. They were clearly a staple, and not just for Renée. Other Parisian lesbians also wore them close to their heart. Can you imagine receiving a gift from your friend of books and flowers symbolising sapphic love? It feels very romantic and swoon-worthy. Vivian earned the title Muse of Violets. When Radcliffe Hall visited Paris in 1926, the itinerary included a trip to the cemetery to place violets on Vivian's grave. On that same trip, Hall saw a play called The Captive by Edouard Bourdet. The Captive, or Le Prisonnier, was staged in both Paris and New York. The play follows the story of Irene, a young woman in a false engagement with a man, but in love and in a real relationship with another woman. Throughout the play, her love interest leaves Irene gifts of violets. Their relationship ends in the final act, also narrated with an exchange of violets. In 4 Flowering Plants That Have Been Decidedly Queered, Prager writes that the theme of lesbianism in this play led to an uproar and calls for a boycott and for censorship. I mean, the relationship ends at the end, like every lesbian thing ever, and what they're complaining about. The New York City District Attorney's Office eventually gave in to these calls and shut down the production in 1927. Wikipedia claims that the play prompted the adoption of a new state law dealing with obscenity, but it doesn't offer a source for that claim. The play also led to public uproar in France, where protesters and police shut down the final performance. But supporters of the play also wore violets pinned to their lapels. In fact, the association of violets with lesbianism became so strong that the University of Washington Botanic Gardens says that florists in the United States actually experienced a crash in violet sales during this time. Violets had become the lesbian flower. According to Metis, a full 7 years after the play was closed, in 1937, Harper's Bazaar reported that way back in the Violet County last year, they were still casting this play as the knell of the violet industry. I'd retrospectively apologise to the violet industry, but it was probably only lesbian customers that kept it going at all. Despite this long-running unfashionability, by 1938, violets were quite literally back in vogue. A feature called Fashion, the Purple Phase, in May 1938's edition of the magazine, explained to the readers that purple and violet are the night-blooming colours of the moment. Violets were once again being worn as an adornment, but this time claimed back from the vocabulary of lesbian style. A shame. I am very here for queer women reclaiming violets as a symbol of sapphic love. Can we bring that back, please? Pansies and other plants. I've already mentioned that one of the few places that purple occurs in nature is in flowers, and there's another flower that's associated with gay men in particular that we haven't discussed yet. Pansies! Though naturally, pansies aren't the only other flower associated with queerness. In 4 flowers that have become queer symbols, Johnson writes that along with buttercup, daisy, and other flowery language, including the somewhat non-specific horticultural lad, I love it, pansy was a term used to refer to gay men, suggesting them to be non-masculine and delicate. Tag yourself, horticultural lads. In the aforementioned article, Prager asks why there's so much floral symbology in queer slang. Are queer people perceived as delicate, colourful, beautiful, frivolous? As the literary critic Christopher Luby notes in the Journal of Criticism, Proust's 1921 take on Sodom and Gomorrah speculated that male-male courting rituals were similar to the process of flower fertilization. I think I have some questions for Proust. Just a few. Pansies were originally violets. That is, they're a cultivar of several different violet species, which means they're the result of gardeners and botanists breeding together different species of violets. She's a lesbian mum and that made her happy. Pansies were first cultivated in the 19th century, and Johnson explains became the symbol for humanist and free thought movements due to the name coming from the French word for thought. Pense. Pansy was used throughout the 20th century as a derogatory term for gay men, and probably into the 21st century as well, if we're being honest. Prager explains that historian George Chauncey coined the term the pansy craze in reference to the 1920s and 30s, writing that, especially in New York City, drag balls starring female impersonators were extravagant and enormous. The police eventually shut them all down, including a 1939 one in Harlem that ended a 70-year annual tradition. Likewise, Hollywood's pansy craze of queer representation in film was ultimately shut down by censors. But not before those movies helped to bring queerness to the national consciousness. Oh, I have a whole video about the Hays Code, which brought an end to overtly queer characters being portrayed on screen. If you want to know more about how queer representation in media changed after the pansy craze. But the LGBTQ+ community is excellent at taking words that have been used to hurt us and reclaiming them. In 2005, British artist Paul Harfleet started the Pansy Project, where he plants pansies at the sites of homophobia and transphobia. Writing about how the Pansy Project began, Harfleet explains that while he had become accustomed to homophobic verbal abuse and violence, he came to realise it was a shocking concept to most of his friends and colleagues. Harfleet writes that he began to ponder the nature of these verbal attacks and their influence on his life. I realised that I felt differently about these experiences depending on my mental state. So I decided to explore the way I was made to feel at the location where these incidents occur. I felt that planting a small, unmarked, living plant at the site would correspond with the nature of the abuse. A plant continues to grow as I do through my experience. Placing a live plant felt like a positive action. It was a comment on the abuse, a potential remedy. I'll leave a link in the comments to the Pansy Project website where you can see a map with all the locations of the pansies planted as part of the project, and also watch the short film about the project for more information. It's called If Homophobia Ended Tomorrow. Lavender Menace. A fun trivia question for you. Where would you be able to find protest signs reading, "Take a lesbian to lunch. Super Dyke loves you. We are your worst nightmare and best fantasy. Women's liberation is a lesbian plot." Oh, I know this one. Is it in the Lavender Menace action at the Second Congress to Unite Women in 1970? Yes! The Lavender Menace were formed to protest the rejection of lesbians in the second wave women's liberation movement. In an article for them, Elisa Goodman writes that, in 1969, feminist author, activist, and now co-founder Betty Friedan referred to lesbians in the organization as a Lavender Menace. In the New York Times Magazine, believing their open presence in the organisation would hinder the respectability of the march towards women's rights and make feminist activists look like unsound man-haters. Don't you just love respectability politics? Goodman continues that year, Rita Mae Brown, long known for being vocal and out, was fired from her position as the editor of Now's newsletter. Many lesbian Now members quit in solidarity. Now was the National Organisation for Women. They really did well with that name. Goodman explains that some lesbian feminist activists had been active in the gay liberation front, but in working with gay men had found themselves adrift. Lavender Menace member Ellen Shumsky wrote for Come Out magazine in 1970 and 1972. So much of the group's actions, they felt, had focused on the interests and rights of gay men. So women from the GLF began to meet separately, also joined by members of the women's liberation movement, which fought against patriarchal, social and sexual norms they felt stifled women's equality. Working together, they crafted a lesbian feminist manifesto to take to the Second Congress to unite women. They called their manifesto the Women Identified Woman. The speakers at the Congress wouldn't include any lesbians. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the majority of the speakers would be straight, white, middle and upper class cis women. The Lavender Menace wanted to show what queer women were and should be part of the feminist movement. It was time to tell the women's movement we would not be ignored any longer, activist Carla J. recounts in her 2000 memoir, Tales of the Lavender Menace, a memoir of liberation. On the 1st of May 1970, 40 or so women interrupted a panel at the Second Congress to Unite Women. Goodman describes how they made their way down to the stage wearing shirts that were hand-dyed various shades of purple, then silkscreened with the words, Lavender Menace. Jay recounts that she shouted, "Yes, yes, sisters! I'm tired of being in the closet because of the women's movement." Now organisers attempted to restore order, but women in the audience were cheering in support. Shumsky described how the Lavender Menace members initiated a forum on why lesbianism was the most threatening and most avoided issue in the women's movement. Instead of purging lesbians from the women's movement, we will proudly own and assert the women-identified women in all of us. Goodman explains that the Lavender Menace members passed out copies of The Woman-Identified Woman, which really sounds like such a mouthful, to the 400 women sitting in the audience. The manifesto encouraged readers to rethink their views on lesbians and to work against separating the women's liberation movement by sexual orientation. Reading about this really reminded me of the conversations that we're having now about trans people. Today, transphobes use the purple, white and green of the suffragettes to signal that they don't think trans women belong in women's spaces, entirely ignoring that queer women and trans women are also women, and trans rights go hand in hand with feminist aims. The Lavender Menace's action was an unquestionable success. As Emily Kahn puts it for NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project, a few women left, but the majority of the audience was engaged by the action's humour and theatricality. Who wouldn't be? The Menaces held the floor for over 2 hours, inviting all attendees to share their thoughts and questions on lesbianism. Anything you'd like to know? Many straight women thanked the Menaces for making them confront their feelings about lesbianism. Amazing. And black and working class women connected with the Menaces' feelings of exclusion in the women's liberation movement. The next 2 days of the Congress featured workshops and debates on lesbian issues. Khan explains that knowing that Lavender Menace will strike again, anywhere, anytime, any place, now passed a resolution acknowledging the double oppression of lesbians as women and homosexuals, and recognising the oppression of lesbians as a legitimate concern of feminism in 1971. It's worth noting that the Lavender Menace members were far from perfect. For example, they didn't support bisexuality and saw it as working against the lesbian cause. I'm so confused. What? I do really want a Lavender Menace t-shirt though. Lavender Rhinoceros! Finally, we get to the part of the video we've all been waiting for. How did a life-size papier-mâché Lavender Rhino end up marching at Boston Pride in 1974? Well, it didn't march so much as get wheeled along, but it was very much part of the action. The Lavender Rhino was designed by artists Daniel Faxton and Bernie Thal for a public ad campaign to encourage visibility of the LGBTQ+ community in Boston. Ariel Gray writes that Toll explained that the rhino was chosen because it is a much maligned and misunderstood animal, and that the colour came from the mixture of pink and blue, a symbolic merger of the masculine and feminine. Much maligned and misunderstood is just an excellent description of the LGBTQ+ community as a whole. However, things didn't go smoothly. Gray explains that by March of 1974, Gay Media Action, who were organising the campaign, had sent press packets detailing the ad campaign to media outlets in Boston. They hoped to gain enough support to run the ads on the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, MBTA, for Boston's Pride March. The designs were initially approved by the MBTA and Metro Transit Advertising, the MBTA's New York City-based advertising agent. However, Gray writes that in May of 1974, Metro Transit Advertising announced that its lawyers were unable to determine eligibility of the public service rate for the Lavender Rhino ads. Oh no. This decision raised the $2 per car card rate for public service projects to a $7 per car card rate, tripling the cost of the campaign. Gay Media Action didn't have the funds to cover the increase in cost, and the Lavender Rhino ads were put on hold. This is the platforms disproportionately suppressing the work of LGBTQ+ people section of the video. It seems that Gay Media Action were denied the rate that would usually be given to community organisations because they were a group of queer people talking openly and without shame about queerness. Gray explained that Gay Media Action decided to challenge the decision to raise the price of the ads. They hired a lawyer, Richard Rubino, to represent them and organised a protest campaign that resulted in hundreds of letters being sent to the MBTA and MTA. Gray continues that, despite the public outcry, the MBTA Board of Directors announced their decision to stand by the price increase in the first week of June. In response, the Lavender Rhino debuted at Boston's Pride March as people wore t-shirts, pins and signs featuring it. A life-sized papier-mâché Lavender Rhino also proceeded along the route, and it was effectively immortalised as a symbol of protest and resistance. Isn't that really cool? I want to march alongside a Lavender Rhino at Pride. Gay Media Action eventually raised enough money to cover the increased cost, though they also scaled down their campaign and strategically targeted the Green Line due to its route through and beyond Boston. By the 3rd of December 1974, the first batch of ads were running, and the Lavender Rhino was visible on the Green Line until February in 1975. But that wasn't the last of the Lavender Rhino. It made a second appearance at Boston Pride in 1987, and a Lavender Rhino flag was raised at Boston City Hall in 1987. Lavender equals queer. Throughout the 20th century, lavender was increasingly used as a shorthand for queer. There are so many examples of this, just reinforcing people's association with queerness. In Violet Delights, A Queer History of Purple, Macmillan says that by the late 1940s, newspapers were casually mentioning the lavender set as a dismissive shorthand for groups of queer men. I shouldn't have got excited there. Lavender set just sounds really nice. Yet even while it was being used derisively and pejoratively, LGBTQ+ people who were reclaiming lavender as a symbol of resistance and strength, as we should. Although the Christopher Street Liberation Day March in June 1970, a year after the Stonewall riots, is often referenced as the origin of Pride, Hastings points out that in July of 1969, there was a Gay Power March from Washington Square Park to Stonewall Inn in New York to commemorate the Stonewall riots that had just taken place a month before. Jonathan Black wrote in the Village Voice on the 31st of July 1969 that they marched under a lavender banner, 500 strong, describing them as a purple column, wearing lavender ribbons and armbands. There are times when lavender was claimed proudly by LGBTQ+ people. Macmillan writes, Queen Joan Jett Black ran for president of the USA with the catchy slogan, "Lick Bush in '92, and a campaign that promised to abolish national debt and appoint dykes on bikes as national security. Unclear as to why she did not win. Redecorating and renaming the presidential residence the Lavender House was also a priority. That's a good campaign slogan. And have you heard of the Lesbian Avengers? Yeah, Macmillan writes that they handed out lavender balloons during a school protest. I feel Lesbian Avengers would also make a great t-shirt. There's also Deathly Allied, or the Lavender Song. Macmillan writes that on the cabaret stages of 1920s Berlin, the Lavender Song was a defiant and catchy anthem that refused to apologise for the pleasures of queer lavender nights. It played in lesbian and trans social clubs like Lotte Hahn's Violetta Club. On a more mainstream stage, an as yet unknown Marlene Dietrich joined cabaret-style Margot Leon on stage to sing a duet about how happy she was with her special friend. Just in case the audience did not get the message, both singers sported posies of violets on their lapels. Lyrics to Das Lille Lied include, "Round us all up, send us away, that's what you'd really like to do, but we're too strong, proud, unafraid. In fact, we almost pity you. You act from fear. Why should that be? What is it that you are frightened of? The way that we dress, the way that we meet, the fact that you cannot destroy our love. We're going to win our rights to lavender days and nights." There are also events that happened during the 20th century where the term lavender has been applied retrospectively by historians, like the Lavender Scare. In an article for Time, Suyan Haynes explained that, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower's executive order, the investigation, interrogation, and systematic removal of gay men and lesbians from the federal government became policy. The policy was based on the unfounded fear that gay men and lesbians posed a threat to national security because they were vulnerable to blackmail and were considered to have weak moral characters, says historian David K. Johnson. It was Johnson who's credited with popularising this term to describe his fear-mongering campaign in his 2004 book, The Lavender Scare. It really shows how legislation that was actively discriminating against LGBTQ+ people is really not that far in the past, or in the past at all. Haynes explains that it was only in 1995 that President Bill Clinton signed an executive order banning discrimination based on sexual orientation in the granting of security clearances, and in 1998 that such discrimination was banned in government employment. Something I do have a whole video about is lavender marriages, which refer to marriages of convenience where one or both partners were gay, often to conceal their queerness. Alice Walker's The Colour Purple. Before we get into this section, I want to let you know that I'm going to briefly mention sexual and physical abuse as well as be discussing transphobia. I will put a timestamp on screen now for where you should skip ahead to if you would like to. The Colour Purple by Alice Walker won a Pulitzer Prize in 1983, making Walker the first black woman to win the award for fiction. In an article for Autostraddle, Carmen Phillips points out that the novel remains the only Pulitzer Prize winner with a black queer woman protagonist. The Colour Purple is an epistolary novel written as a series of letters between protagonist Celie and her sister Nettie. I'm going to share the summary of the book that award-winning critic and screenwriter Brooke Obie gives in an article for Anscape. Celie has been severely abused by her stepfather, by whom she's had 2 children, and her husband Mr., which has made her believe that God has forgotten her. But her memories of her long-lost sister Nettie and her friendship with the strong-willed Sophia, who says hell no to domestic violence, teach her how to be strong and fight back. Celie's romantic and sexual awakening with her husband's sometimes mistress, Shug Avery, starts Celie on a path to experiencing true love. She learns that God hasn't forgotten her, but lives inside her and everything else, even something as small and as brilliant and beautiful as The Colour Purple. The novel has appeared on the American Library Association's list of the 100 most frequently challenged books of 1990 to 1999, 2000 to 2009, and 2010 to 2019. Seeley's queerness and her relationship with Shug is a major part of why the colour purple has been the target of repeated censorship. In an article for Los Angeles Times, Ashley Lee explains that Walker created Seeley and Shug's relationship in the novel because she wanted to give my family and friends an opportunity to see women loving women in a recognisable context. I wanted them, I suppose, to see me. The book is deep, often traumatic, but also joyful. On first reading and being much younger, I found something wonderful in knowing that the sunbeams shining through the darkness of Seeley's life came from a same-sex relationship rather than what we're often presented with when it comes to queer fiction, that the queerness itself is the problem causing the darkness. Yet, adaptations of the novel don't necessarily stay true to Walker's vision for Seeley and Shug's relationship, nor give queer black women a rare opportunity to actually see themselves on screen. A scene that has attracted particular controversy is the scene where the two women kiss. Obi writes that, in Spielberg's adaptation, when Seeley cries out that no one loves her, Shug loudly declares that she does and proceeds to kiss Seeley tenderly wherever she asks, on her right cheek, on her forehead, on her left cheek, and then her mouth. Spielberg's lens follows Shug's hand as it caresses Seeley's shoulder, and then Seeley's hand as it clasps Shug's. Then Spielberg cuts away to tingling wind chime. It's sensual and romantic and heavily suggestive, but it's also a cop-out for never going further than that on screen. But even the idea that there was going to be a kiss between the characters in the film had caused considerable and homophobic panic. Walker recalls how producer Quincy Jones received numerous letters from people who adamantly opposed any display of sexual affection between Seeley and Shug and threatened to boycott the film. The scene's very inclusion demanded a bit of gentle insistence on Walker's part with Spielberg, Jones and screenwriter Menno Meyers. And the final version, though it does depict a joyous reciprocal encounter, lacks the sensuousness of Walker's description in the novel. It's important to add that the watering down of Seeley and Shug's relationship isn't the only controversy around the 1985 film. In an article for Time, Katie Lang writes that it was also roundly critiqued for having both a white male director, Spielberg, and a white male screenwriter, Menno Meyers, a denunciation that was even more glaring in light of the contention level at the film because of its depiction of black men, which many people and advocacy groups felt reinforced racial stereotypes of black masculinity as violent. There was hope that the new adaptation of the stage musical, which was released on Christmas Day in 2023, would finally allow Seeley to revel in her queerness in the way Walker intended. However, there was some confusion and disappointment with several of director Blitz Bazawule's choices, including how the camera backs away from the kiss between Seeley and Shug, hiding it in the shadows as if it's something illicit and unpalatable. I know that some people find the idea of a musical adaptation of the book to be a little gauche, a little odd, but I recently watched the film version of the musical on a long flight, and I absolutely bawled my eyes out, despite being a deaf girl on an aeroplane. The music and the dancing does not detract from the serious themes. Many of the musical numbers add to more weighty moments, but also the new adaptation skews Seeley's feelings for Shug as being one-sided. There's a scene where Seeley tells Shug that Mr. beats her when Shug is not there. She begs Shug to take her to Memphis, Tennessee with her, but a rather callous Shug just says, "Next time," and drives away, leaving Seeley with her abuser. Brooke Obi explains that in contrast, Walker's version of Shug would never do such a thing. In the novel, she promises Seeley, "I won't leave until I know that Albert, Mr., won't even think about beating you." The Shug in the book breaks up with Mr. over his abuse of Seeley, saying, Albert, you've been mistreating somebody I love. So as far as you're concerned, I'm gone. Comparatively, Henson Shug doesn't just seem flighty, but cruel and dismissive, playing with Celia's feelings and well-being. In her review of the movie musical, Phillips agrees that she's not sure it takes Shug and Celia's relationship as far as stage productions have. There's almost an air of discomfort, an unspoken agreement. Okay, we'll finally say that Celia and Shug were gay for each other, but not too much now on our straight sisterhood icons. As if Celia and Shug's queerness isn't at the very root of the very sisterhood we are proclaiming to be honoured. The Colour Purple has never been only about black women saving each other. It's about black women finding beauty and worth in each other, in all aspects of who they are. And on this, Alice Walker could not be more clear. That means in the bedroom as well. Apparently we're still scared of queer women being able to own their sexuality and get a happy ending, especially when it comes to queer women of colour. It's incredibly disappointing. This representation, or lack thereof, is crucial in terms of who is working behind the scenes as well as who we see on screen. Considering every adaptation of The Colour Purple, it probably doesn't surprise anyone that the last time a black American Southern queer woman got to create the story of a black American Southern queer Celia and Shug was back in the early 1980s when Walker first wrote the book. As Odie says, when the same mistakes keep getting made adapting her work, it's time to start looking at who's behind these adaptations. Whatever the behind-the-scenes excuses were this time around, what's clear is that gender and cultural specificity matters. If we weren't going to get it, we at least needed a filmmaking team that would have been willing to fight over the erasure of the queer black women's love story. We needed a studio system that wouldn't have even put the filmmakers in the position in the first place. Despite these totally justified criticisms of the 2023 film, it's notable and kind of horrifying that Barzilai and screenwriter Marcus Gardley are the first black creatives to helm an adaptation of The Colour Purple. Oh, awkward moment, because unfortunately I can't talk about The Colour Purple in 2024 without acknowledging how Walker has endorsed J.K. Rowling's transphobia, I know. In an essay published on her website in March 2023, Walker echoes the unfounded concerns that women are being erased in language and disappeared from dictionaries and society. In a piece for astronomers, Deirdre Jones-Austin writes that Walker appeals to Rowling's critics as an elder and writes that we shouldn't be tampering with the miracle of the human body as it relates to gender and sex. Oh. Can famous and much loved authors please just stop sharing transphobic ideas? Doesn't seem that hard. That said, I think it's valid to still enjoy The Colour Purple today. It is a seminal piece of lesbian literature, and even more than 4 decades after it was published, the experiences of queer black women are still underrepresented in mainstream media. Spirit Day! In this next section, I am going to briefly mention suicide and discuss anti-LGBTQ+ bullying. Timestamp here. To skip ahead, please take care of yourself. All of this brings us back to the 21st century, where the rainbow has somewhat overtaken lavender and violet as the brand colour of the LGBTQ+ community. We do have a gay agenda, yes, but our own meetings are very chaotic. We don't get much done. However, purple does still hold an important place in the heart of the queer community. Spirit Day is described by GLAAD as the world's most visible anti-bullying movement, inspiring LGBTQ+ youth, especially transgender and non-binary youth, to live their lives in their truth and authenticity. Founded in 2010 by Canadian teenager Brittany McMillan, and originally organised on Tumblr of course, Spirit Day encourages LGBTQ+ people and allies to go purple and show support of queer and trans youth and speak out against bullying. An article from Autostraddle in 2014 explains how Brittany came up with the idea of getting together to wear purple, the colour representing spirit, on the pride flag, in remembrance and support of those queer teens who struggle with suicide and suicidal ideation due to anti-queer bullying, harassment and alienation. The day picked was October 20th. Eager to do something visible and positive and productive with grief and rage, we latched onto the wonderful idea and spread the word like wildfire. This year's Spirit Day is on Thursday the 17th of October. Although it is primarily celebrated in the US and Canada, I am already planning my outfit. In doing the research for this video, I came across a blog post by the Indiana Youth Group, who create safe spaces for and work to empower young LGBTQ+ people and magnify their voices, explaining why they chose purple as their brand colour in a way I found quite emotional, and so I wanted to share it with you. Purple is striking and bold. It is also a reminder of the beauty that pops up in some of the most unlikely of places. Think of violet wildflowers popping up amongst a dry, colourless prairie, or a cluster of lilacs protruding defiantly from an overwhelmingly green garden. Queer young people are a splash of colour who pop up in defiance of the world around them. They are unapologetically vibrant and bold. As Medhurst puts it in Dressing Dykes, purple is a symbol of the other, the different or deviant. No wonder we're drawn to it. Thank you all for joining me on this exploration of why purple is such a queer colour. Leave a comment and let me know what you would think about a merch line that might include wearing violets as a subtle way to signal our queerness. Or maybe we could make badges with Lavender Rhinoceroses on them. Rhinoceros? Rhino? I am sensing I've given myself a new crafting challenge. And thank you of course to June's Journey for sponsoring this video. You can download June's Journey for free now using the link in the description and start your adventure today. If you enjoyed this video, I think you would also like my video about whether or not Francesca Bridgerton should be queer, a video in which I also wear purple. Or maybe my series of videos about historical figures who are gay or disabled and we don't get taught about in school. You can click there. You should also follow me on Instagram, where I am at Jessica Out of the Closet. As always, I want to say a massive thank you to everyone in the Kellgren-Fozard Club for your support. The KF Club, or my Clubbies, is a membership club here on YouTube which you can join. Clubbies get a whole bunch of cool perks like monthly behind the scenes videos. If you comment on my video, you get a little picture of my face after your name. Get access to some special emojis, and your comments rise up to the top. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye bye!